We have Matt Damon starring as Odysseus in the upcoming Christopher Nolan film. And I've seen a lot of reaction to this, particularly in relation to what he's wearing. And I actually want to talk about something that he's not actually wearing here, but an item of clothing or rather armour that is very much linked to Odysseus. And here it is, the boar's tusk helmet. This one is Mycenaean and it dates to the 14th century BC. So these existed. And we have it referred to by Homer in Book 10 of the Iliad. At that point, the Greeks are in a really, really bad place. And so they decide to send a couple of individuals across the plain to the Trojan camp and do some mischief. And the two individuals are Diomedes and Odysseus. This is done at night, so this is quite unlike any other encounter. They're not doing a full-blown battle thing here. What they do is actually quite nasty. I won't go into details here, but they're successful. And they cause a small amount of carnage in, I think it's the Thracian end of the camp. But Odysseus is given this to wear, and this is what I want to talk about, the boar's tusk helmet, because there's elements here that are thematic, and it also draws upon a wider question and discussion about Homer and the Iliad. To start with, this isn't something which Odysseus owns. It's not his. It actually belongs to Meriones. Now, Meriones is a notable warrior in the Greek camp, and of course, they're getting ready, so they're not at their own tents or parts of the camp, so they've got to get kitted out in what they can get. And so Meriones gives him this to wear. But it was actually something that had been in Odysseus's family, because Odysseus's grandfather was a notable, somewhat infamous character called Autolycus. And Autolycus was a bit of a thief. In fact, he was an arch thief. He was very good at stealing things, and he'd stolen this and given it to someone, given it to someone who'd given it to the father of Meriones. So it's made its way all the way back round, and now Odysseus is wearing it. The fact that the item has its own backstory is, in of itself, an interesting thing. And the fact that it has a thematic reference here to sort of skullduggery is also interesting, because again, what Odysseus is about to do is a bit sneaky. This is not your standard Greek heroic battle. This is something being undertaken at night. It's a secret, spying, you get the idea. It's all of those things. And what better than to have an object itself which was stolen, and stolen by one of the most famous thieves of antiquity. And also the irony that it ends up on the head of Odysseus, but he doesn't even own it. Now there's something else going on here, because this feels like a bit of an heirloom. This isn't an item which is worn by anyone else. Generally speaking, we hear, or rather read in the poem, of heroes wearing sort of bronze helmets, that kind of a thing. We don't find these kind of items. So there's a sort of argument as to whether or not this was considered a bit of a relic by the time that Odysseus was donning it and making his way through to the Trojan camp by night. And this itself touches on a wider discussion point about Homer. To what extent the myth of the Iliad was being retold through a more modern view, that is to say, of the time of Homer. So what Homer was doing was taking a myth that had happened centuries before and retelling it using modern values, more modern conventions, associations that his audience would understand. But obviously there were these legacy references or touch points, and this is a good example of one of them. And actually there's another one in the Iliad which I've mentioned before, and that is at the funeral of Patroclus, a number of Trojan prisoners are sacrificed, which presumably can't have been something held as a normal thing in the time of Homer. And in Homer's other work, the Odyssey, there's an instance where Odysseus needs to speak to the dead, and he undertakes an unusual ritual which involves digging a trench. And this has been argued as something that's mirroring, or perhaps being a reference to earlier Hittite pit rituals, which achieved a similar sort of thing, or intended to, that is, to either have discourse with deities or invoke the dead in some way. Now, obviously, there's a whole debate about that. Those are just a couple of instances. But going back, more importantly, to the helmet, I'd love to see this worn by Odysseus in the film. Though if it is, the question will be, will Meriones have lent it to him, or would he have gone down the traditional family route and nicked it?